Hey guys, welcome back to today's video. Today is Wednesday, March 27th, 2024, and today we are going to be talking about a last night special election in the state of Alabama, in the state House of Representatives, in which the Democratic Party has flipped a Republican district, a Trump district, a district that the Republican Party has long held on to when it comes down to their state House delegation, swinging it over 25 points to the left in the wake of issues surrounding IVF and the issue of abortion. Now, Alabama is not at all a state that Democrats have had much hope in over the past couple of election cycles. Alabama voted for President Trump by 25.5%, and on the county map side, really doesn't see that much support outside of, this middle part region of the state itself. And, looking at the past elections, Alabama never really has been too kind to Democrats, except in the 2017 Senate election, in which there was a special election that took place in the state of Alabama that gave Democrats a victory against Roy Moore, who was convicted, or not convicted, but who was under, scrutiny for things that I'd rather not mention on this channel. But, the takeaway there is that the scandal was big enough that a Republican had lost in the state of Alabama. And so now this time around, people are wondering, why is it that this district flipped so significantly? I mean, many major media outlets are picking up this story because it is quite notable. It pretty much puts a halt in all of this narrative here that Republicans are doing tremendously better than they did in 22, in 2020, in 2016, 2018, all of this talk and jibber jabber about Republicans being able to run up the margins when it actually matters is almost always halted when elections are held as special elections in between this time and the November general election. I remember all the narrative, being spun around the New York 3rd District that Tom Suozzi was going to lose, that Macy Pilip was going to pull out this victory because it was inherently a Republican district. George Santos had won it by 8, Kathy Hochul had lost it by more, and this district wasn't going to flip back to the Democratic Party. And then it did. It did, and it outperformed for Democrats in the polls by 4 percentage points, and everybody was saying, this is now big for Democrats, and then a week later, everybody forgot. And I think that's the big thing that we see here, is that generally speaking, the only real indicators of an eventual election are these special elections. And I think looking back at 2020 and 2022 and 2018 even, the warning signs were not always found in the polls, but rather in the special elections. I want to take a step back and look at the 2022 midterm elections because it was a midterm election that I think many people did not expect. Democrats, were able to maintain significant number of seats in the House of Representatives, a significant number of seats in the United States Senate, in fact, expanded their majority of the U.S. Senate, despite being down in the national popular vote in the polls by 3, and ended up actually losing it by 3 on Election Day. So the question is, why is it that so many people got it off? Well, it wasn't exactly that everybody got it wrong. If you were looking strictly at special elections, you actually would have found that this was not too far off. And so we head over to the first special election, the state of Minnesota, which the first district had an election that you saw, Republicans really looking at for direction. Is this going to be an improvement for Democrats? Is this going to be a region of the state where the Dobbs-Jackson decision makes a difference? And so the Cook PVI here is Republican +7. In the 2020 presidential election, Donald Trump won here by 10 points. And yet in the congressional race, it had narrowed down just, less than 2 years later to a 4-point margin of victory, a 3-point margin of victory for the Republican Party in this state. And so why does that matter? Well, it shows about a 7-point shift away from the, Republican Party, away from Donald Trump. But more importantly, it was the first true test here for Democrats. And so what Democrats got here was that they drove up turnout. They made the race more competitive than, it had otherwise had meant to be. But it wasn't just here. This was a sign, but it wasn't everything. It wasn't enough for us to concretely say that these special elections are in direct defiance of what the national polls are saying, what the national headlines are saying. The special elections are telling us that the year wasn't going to be too bad for Democrats. Republicans might have been able to still edge it out, as indicated by this one very, very early on. But, we needed some more things. And so we headed over to the state of Alaska, where there was the at-large congressional district special election just a week later. And of course, we didn't get these results for weeks on end because it took time for people to send in their ballots. So the election was held. We knew the first round of voting, and that's when counting stopped. We had been waiting for weeks and weeks and weeks. We were waiting to see the Alaska Secretary of State confirm these numbers here. But by the end of it, when Mary Peltola had ended up winning, it was a huge sign. It was a sign that a state that Donald Trump won by 10 was shifting over in favor of the Republican Party. In favor of the Democratic Party. And it had shifted by roughly 3 percentage points. And so Alaska was a huge victory for Democrats. I mean, they looked at that and said, this is phenomenal. This is a district here that Republicans should have been able to hold on to. It's a Republican state. Sarah Palin was the vice presidential nominee for the Republicans in 2008. All the signs had indicated that Alaska probably should have stayed red, but it didn't, and it went blue. And again, a sign that had been told as a story, throughout this entire time. Then in the 19th Congressional District, this was a pretty strong victory for Democrats. It was one that wasn't exactly super, amazing, right? It was a 3-point margin of victory, but Pat Ryan, for many people, was expected to lose. The predictions here were that Republicans were going to either flip the district, and the polls had indicated that that was nearly a guarantee. And yet, on Election Day, the Democrats pulled through. It was another overperformance in the polls, as there was an overperformance in Alaska, as there was an overperformance in Minnesota's 1st District, and so it really called into question here. These are a significant number of special elections that are completely against what the mainstream media's narrative has been, that Republicans are going to absolutely dominate this November, or at the time, was that November. And it didn't end up happening. And we remember what we saw on election night in 2022. And again, if you were to take a look at these special elections independently, away from the generic ballot polling, away from the punditry of the Washington Post and the New York Times and Politico. And granted, conventional wisdom told us Democrats were going to get demolished in these midterm elections. President Biden was down by over 10 points nationally in terms of approval, and Democrats only lost 10 seats. In 2010, when Democrats lost 63 seats, President Obama's approval was down just 5 points. And so to see that doubled for President Biden and the numbers only shift down by 10 tells you some things mattered more to voters than just a referenda on President Biden in any way they saw that fit. And so I think this is exactly why you see the 2024 election and see a lot of people now looking back to 2022 as an indicator that, maybe we should start paying closer attention to these special elections and closer attention to more localized races that could serve as microcosms for the nation and start to predict elections that way. And so that's what I think we should do with these states like Alabama, where we do have these election results coming in that do show the Democratic Party in a much better position than otherwise, right? Donald Trump won this district, right? When Doug Jones, the senator from Alabama, who won in the state, won in this district, won this district by just 5 points. For a Democrat to win, Alabama, you're talking shifting the state 30 points to the left. And yet this district only voted blue by 5. And so for now, Maryland lands to win with 62% of the vote. And now have to ask, why exactly did this happen? Well, in true 2022 fashion, it was the issue of IVF and abortion, which shaped the battle in this Alabama special election. This is a race that was dominated nearly entirely by ads, rallies, whatever it might be, solely focused on the issue of abortion and IVF because the state of Alabama made a decision. The Supreme Court in Alabama ruled that frozen embryos are children and thus halted IVF treatments and thus compared and equated IVF and prohibiting that to the banning of abortion. And so voters in this state, Republicans and Democrats, similar to the Dobbs decision, honestly, were outraged, but outraged at a higher point. It had been seeming as if Republicans were going too extreme. People knew who appointed people to the Alabama Supreme Court. People knew what ideology these Supreme Court justices represented. And so with this association around them, many of the voters in this district probably used this and likely did use this based on what we're seeing from internal reports from the ground, based on what we're seeing in the actual election results and, interviews with the local press, is that voters did in fact care about IVF and abortion as an important thing that they were voting on. In their eyes, it was forget the economy, it was forget their statewide and local issues, and maybe not entirely, right? But it wasn't at the center point of their minds when they got to the ballot box there. They were voting on an issue like this one. And we often, forget that in 2022, that was the strategy that landed Democrats nearly maintaining the House majority and expanding seats in the U.S. Senate. And now it's happening again. While abortion may seem like an issue that to the average Republican voter doesn't matter as much, it still very much matters and is still absolutely a motivational factor for the Democratic base. When Republicans had 50 years to crusade against Roe versus Wade from 1972, when that was implemented, right? You had this going on the 50th year of its anniversary in which the Dobbs v. Jackson decision dropped, 1972, 1973. You have Roe v. Wade, you have an expectation that Roe v. Wade might be implemented, and a general consensus even back then that abortion should be legal. Protests were the same way. Public opinion really did not shift too tremendously from 1973. And so then 50 years pass, and then in 2022, it struck down. And so for all that time in between, Republicans could publicly say and publicly use this as a rallying call to their supporters. Get out and we will turn this country pro-life. Get out and we will turn the Supreme Court pro-life, and we will ban abortion. But the talking point from independents that were willing to vote for Republicans prior to the Dobbs decision was that it wasn't going to happen, that there was precedent that had been tried and tested, and that things like this were impossible. Issues like these were impossible to tackle. Gay marriage is protected. Abortion is protected. DACA is protected. Obamacare is protected. There was this idea that the Supreme Court, because they had ruled in one instance in favor of liberals, in favor of Democrats, or in favor of the majority opinion of the nation, that they would consistently do so regardless of who was on the court. And so when Hillary Clinton went out there and said, if you elect Donald Trump, abortion will go away, everybody said, you're crazy. Everybody said that's not going to happen. Everybody said that he wouldn't do that. He said it on the campaign trail that he would not seek to overturn Roe versus Wade, while simultaneously in his party platform seeking to overturn Roe versus Wade. It was like the Republicans were saying exactly what they wanted to do with it, and nobody was listening. And that's fair, right? That happens all the time in American politics. At least it's fair in the sense that you have these things happen. It isn't just the issue of abortion. People make false promises or lie to voters all the time on things related to healthcare and the economy and the border or whatever it might be. But then there becomes an immediate impact on women's reproductive health because of a Supreme Court decision, and then consequently, because this channel is focused on elections, an impact on their electoral strategy, an impact on their election chances. And this Alabama special election exemplifies exactly that. What we will see here, and I think what we should be taking away from this, is that a Democrat won a special election in a district they should have had no chance in, given the national environment. Even with the 2020 numbers factored in, the numbers on the national stage seem to be better for Republicans than they were ever in the past 8 years on the presidential level. Donald Trump never led Hillary Clinton for a consistent period of time in national polling data, and Donald Trump has led Joe Biden for months on end. There were never a point in time in which Donald Trump led in every single swing state in the 2016 and 2020 election, and yet he leads in all of them, and in some outside the margin of error and in the majority. When we see numbers like those, it makes no sense that these elections should be shifting this far in favor of the Democratic Party. Genuinely, it makes no sense, but that's what we've started to see over the past few years. Since the Dobbs v. Jackson decision, there has been this silent base that quietly cares a lot about abortion, but doesn't get picked up in these polls, in these focus groups, in this, really in-depth analysis of the election. And that's why I was wrong back in 2022 when I said Pennsylvania was going to go red, and John Fetterman ended up winning it by 5. That, Republicans were going to do better than they did in Arizona or Georgia or New Hampshire or Washington State. All of these things in the House of Representatives, I wrote off any possibility that Democrats could hold on to a considerable number of seats. I mean, I was honestly expecting, I didn't make an eventual House prediction, but if I had to have, I would have said Republicans were going to win 20 to 30 seats at least, at the bare minimum, given our national environment. And it was just 10. But who didn't capture that? The polls, the pundits, and there was a reason. Because based on what we had understood from 2020 was that, Joe Biden should have won Michigan by 7, according to the polls. He won it by 3. Pennsylvania, that one was pretty spot on. Wisconsin, though, he should have won by 7. He won by 0.6. Arizona, Georgia, Nevada, all states that at different periods of time, weeks leading into the election, Joe Biden was up by considerably more than what he won on Election Day. It felt very similar to 2016, except Democrats had lucked out. But again, issues like abortion have put a halt on this entirely. When 67% of this nation is pro-choice, it becomes hard to really, fail to recognize that Democrats are not going to be able to have that as a winning issue. Because it is a winning issue. It is something that Democrats have, not tried to, but, have benefited from because voters are angry about a decision from the Supreme Court. Just as Alabama voters were angry about this decision from the Alabama Supreme Court. And so I will say, looking at these numbers, looking at where we are, when it comes down to special elections and what the special elections did mean in 2022, I would be cautious and cautious in saying that Republicans absolutely have this election in the bag, because I genuinely do not believe that is true. I think what we are going to find is that as these special elections go forth, that will be another test. Congressional special elections are often a very good litmus test as to where, you're seeing improvements for parties, improvements for candidates. And I think what we will see in New York's 26th, California's 20th, Ohio's 6th, and Colorado's 4th, with all the other special elections scheduled for the November election, so it really won't matter. But all of these will give us good indicators about who's going to be up in November and whether the polls today are accurately capturing in those sentiments. Because if I was to bet, based on these numbers in Alabama and in other parts of the country, I wouldn't bet that they are. So thank you guys so much for watching this video. Make sure to comment down suggestions below. Subscribe on the left if you haven't already, and check out the Instagram and Twitter. At the bottom left of the screen, there's also a Discord server for you to go ahead and join. On the screen, there's a video you can watch, and then a playlist for 2024 election analysis videos. Again, thank you guys so much for watching, and I will see you all tomorrow.